Welcome to Spine in Motion, Mastering Flexion. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so glad you're here. We just finished a few weeks ago a similar course devoted to spinal extension, meaning backward bending. This course will be all about flexion, forward bending. What you can expect, there will be 5 sessions, similar to today's session, 90 minutes long. And those sessions will include a little theory, because I'd love you to understand what we're working on. Theory in terms of mechanics of our body, how anatomy looks like, what happens during these movements. And a full Feldenkrais lesson. You will have an experiential learning where you will be lying on the floor or sitting in a chair, depending on the lesson, and performing movements. Then we'll have time for questions and answers. And in between the segments, we will have 5 short videos recorded where you will do as a daily program, about 15-minute long sessions that you will do. So Mondays we'll have classes like this, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, you will have homework. On Sunday, you can either rest, do nothing, or repeat the whole lesson from earlier the week. All right, let's do a little theory. 2 of the resources that I use throughout the course is the Complete Anatomy app for all anatomical pictures. It's a wonderful application. And the book of Dr. Donald Newman, Kinesiology of Musculoskeletal System. When we talk about our spine, our ideal spine in standing, it already have curves. So it's not a straight structure. If you think of it, our thoracic spine is in flexion when it's in neutral. And you could say it's quite significant because it's about 40 degrees between the top vertebra of the thoracic spine and the bottom vertebra of the thoracic spine. You have them at around 40 degrees. This curve is also neighbored with 2 opposite curves toward arching of the neck and arching of the lower back, 45 degrees in the lower back and about 35 degrees in the neck. So our ideal spine is not straight, it's beautifully curved. It has a nice harmonious curve throughout all the segments. Flexion, what happens in flexion? So when we forward bend, as in touching toes and doing stretches, hamstring stretches, or when we tie our shoes, vertebra throughout the spine move. The top vertebra, here's the example of the thoracic, and on the right side is the lumbar. L is for lumbar, T is for thoracic. So what happens with flexion, the bodies of vertebra tilt a little bit forward, making the front a little bit compressed, or front gaps where the discs are a little bit shorter, and the back gaps a little bit wider, a little bit longer. In the back of our vertebra, we have what's called spinous processes. These are the bumps. If you put your finger, go ahead, put your right finger somewhere in the back between your shoulder blades or neck. If you touch, you feel those bumps. These places here in the back, when you touch your back, you feel this spinous processes. Spinous processes are quite far away from the bodies of vertebra. So if you think of spinal column, the thing that holds you up, it's actually more centered than the surface that we are touching. You would need to really think of at least 2 inches forward into the body to see the spinal column. Of course, we cannot touch the spinal column. What's significant about those places in the back is that's where the joints between one vertebra and another live. So in the spinal column, we have discs. One bone is resting with a pillow of a disc on top of another bone. But in terms of joints, the joints are in the back. Here we have it marked with those little ovals. Here's the zygomatic apophyseal joint in the back of the one thoracic vertebra on top of the other. So during the flexion, these joints open. The bone on top is sliding relatively to bone on the bottom, and those joints are starting to open up. Here in the lumbar spine, a similar thing. You can see part of the facet joint of the second lumbar vertebra showing, because it slid forward, it slid upward in front of the bottom one. So when we flex, these joints open up, the holes through which nerves exit increase in size, the front of the vertebra get compressed a little bit, the back of the spinal column expands. So that's what happens throughout our spine. Basically, we can think of three strategies of bending forward. Here, Dr. Newman in his book has these three. Ones he calls normal, when there is a distribution between the pelvis tilting forward in the hip joints, and then uniform spinal bend flexion to touch toes. So it's a combination of hip plus entire spine. In central figure here on the B is you see somebody doing the movement of forward bending practically mostly from the spine. Pelvis, if you look at this pelvis, it's barely tilted forward comparing to this one, right? Here you have, I would say, probably 80 degrees or 70, 80 degrees of bending in the hip joint. Here it's barely changed its relationship to the femur. And therefore, it's predominantly spine that's bending. So limited movement in the hip, massive movement in the spine here. The third option is practically no movement in the spine. An entire movement of reaching toward the toes is done from the hip joints. You see quite a big amount of flexion in the hip and practically straight spine, neutral spine. So we have these three strategies that we can use when bending forward. In sitting, what happens in sitting? Again, here you have the lumbar vertebra. In extension is tilting backward, so like a backward bending. This happens when the pelvis tilts forward. Like you see movement in the picture A, pelvis is tilted forward, the seat bones go back, and the back arches. This is extension. And then you have the reversal, figure B, when the pelvis tilts back, seat bones actually rock forward, and you round your spine. So as you're sitting here, can you do a movement, come to the front edge of the seat and do the movement of rocking your pelvis toward arching, meaning as if to look up toward the ceiling, tilt your pelvis forward, feel your lower back arching, and then tilt your pelvis backward, feel your seat bones actually relatively move forward. You rock on the back of your seat bones and your sacrum comes toward the floor, toward the seat, toward the cushion, and your spine rounds, it flexes. So just as in this picture, you can predict that somewhere in the lumbar spine, the top joint, the facet joint, slides upward relatively to the bottom. And what happens? How is it significant? Because when I work with people with back pain, my first question is to move or not to move. Do at this stage of the person's healing, do I want them to move the spine, or do I want to teach them how to navigate everyday functions like getting dressed, getting out of bed, sitting to standing without any spinal movements? Because in some stages when things are super acute, I don't want movement in the spine. I want to leave it alone. Then my next question is, when it's time to reintroduce movement of the spine, Would I go with flexion, forward bending, as bringing knees to chest, bringing head to knees or elbows to knees, which is flexion? Or do I want to move them through extension, through arching? Because certain conditions, in the moment I'll explain, certain conditions do well with extension approach. Others may do better with flexion approach. In later stages of rehabilitation, I would say both movements are necessary because you need both movements. You need to be able to arch and you need to be able to bend forward. You need to be able to tie your shoes, right? There is no life without flexion. Here's another example of the distribution of movement, of ideal movement throughout our entire spine. So here we have a cervical spine, meaning neck, middle back, thoracic, and lumbar. In green is what we are working in this course, meaning flexion and extension or sagittal plane, movements occurring, forward bending and backward bending. If you look at the natural distribution of spine, you see that some vertebrae move much more than others. For example, C5 on C6 is the most movement one can get in forward bending and backward bending. Interestingly enough, if you look at the prevalence of injuries of the discs, this is the place that gets very often injured. So places where we move a lot typically may get vulnerable to injuries. Some other places like T2, T3, or some upper thoracic vertebra, they move very little. You see 5 degrees or even less of motion. So throughout the next 5 weeks, we are going to work on learning how to distribute the movement throughout the entire spine so it's similar to what we're seeing here. Because so often what happens is in the place where it doesn't move, other places pick up the responsibility and they move too much. They move the entire motion of bending forward, lifting boxes, or tying your shoes happens from just 1 or 2 vertebrae. That's not healthy. We want movement that flows throughout your whole system and not even spine only. So some good news and bad news about flexion. Good news is that with full flexion, foraminal openings, these are the holes through which nerves exit, increase. So that's why so many people with back pain initially really like to have their knees bent or even bringing knee to chest because the holes through which the nerves exit get larger. So therefore nerves have a little bit more room. Now the bad news is that with forward bending, the discs are being displaced backward, so into those holes actually. So sometimes it's a little of a conundrum, like person wants to bring the knees to chest because that opens up the hole, but at the same time, more of the disc material is being pressed into that hole. So we need to be smart about our approaches. Another bad news could be that the joints, those facet joints, when in upright position, like when I show you that ideal spine upright with those 3 normal curves, the weight bearing is distributed about 80% through the spinal column, meaning through discs and those bodies of vertebra, and 20% of weight and compression is being held by those joints, those facet joints in the back. Now, with forward bending, since the facet joints open, they don't transmit any more force, and therefore entire loading can be pushed into the vertebral bodies and the discs. So for somebody with the disc problems, flexion, maybe it needs to be done in a smart way. Some counterindication and precautions, because of course, there are certain conditions where flexion is not indicated, and for example, osteoporosis, there will be a lot of questions, I bet, from the audience. Should I do this course if I have osteoporosis or if I have osteopenia? In general, flexion, if you look across the board, the recommendations in the medical field, flexion is to be avoided with osteoporosis, because what happens is you lean forward on the bodies of vertebra. And if those body of vertebra are weakened, they're vulnerable. So often people fracture while sneezing or while lifting something light from the floor. Another condition that you may want to watch for is acute disc problems. So if your symptoms, as a general rule of thumb, if you have pain or numbness or tingling or definitely some weakness in the legs while doing forward bending, this course is not for you. I would suggest you consulting with a physician, with your clinician, and find out what is the best approach. We don't want any pain. Throughout the course, I'll be repeating to you, there is no sense in making movements that hurt, and avoid all kind of symptoms. Now, saying that, I also say that there is no way of living without flexion, even if you have osteoporosis or even if you have discal problems. Here's interesting studies questioning whether disc herniations are part of a normal aging process. So with 20-year-olds of people who never had back pain, 30% will have herniation of nucleus pulposus, meaning the herniation of discs. 37% of 20-year-olds with no pain will show signs of degenerative disc disease. So this is huge, right? People no pain, could be athletic, and there is quite a bit of chance that they have herniations of discs. So would I recommend them to avoid bending? Absolutely not. Look at this statistic. The same group, but 80-year-old people without any pain, 84% have disc herniations, and 94% will have degenerative disc disease on MRIs, on films. So this is one study. Another interesting study was in 2009 when they follow athletes, and they found no correlation between the prevalence of disc on films and back pain. So my point of view is that I really, that when somebody comes with a positive MRI, I want to find out more. Is it really what brings their pain? Is it really the pain generator, or is it just coincidental finding? So again, more about that. To flex or not to flex? Should we avoid flexion or not? Here was a study, solid study that show lifting weights with spine inflection, because so often you hear, right, you should lift with straight back. This is a across the board recommendation. However, the studies show that maybe not. There was no risk factor between people with more lumbar flexion or less lumbar flexion with risk of low back pain. Spinal loads, these are 3 studies here that show that spinal loads were similar when lifting with spine flexed, comparing to lift with a natural or normal curve straight lumbar spine. That here gets even more interesting, that spinal flexion might be actually a necessary trigger to strengthen your discs, to remodel there. So there is some minimum loading thresholds that are necessary for body to recreate healthy tissues. If you go only into avoidance mode, because I had once herniated disc and I had so much pain and I had struggled so much, I decide for the rest of my life to avoid flexion, I might be doing myself disservice. Here, the study showing that discs feed through movements. They're like sponges. When you make movements of flexion, extension, creating a circulation, you improving circulation, not through blood, because actually the vascularization of the disc is only on the outside rings, and deep inside there is no blood vessels there. So how does disc get its nutrients? It's through movements, through loading and unloading. So flexion may be an necessary component. A little bit of stress may be necessary for our body to recreate healthier tissues. The same thing for bone health, osteoporosis, right? This study showed that where they removed demanding activities from the program, they would see increase in risk of bone degeneration on their bone scans. And then they showed that moderate intensity was not enough. Moderate intensity activities alone were found to be insufficient in providing a mechanical stimulus to prevent bone degeneration. So introducing more demanding activities might be essential to regrowing healthy bone tissue. Now, of course, it's always a tricky part, because if somebody's spine or bones are so osteoporotic that it's practically like powder, of course, if you put too much stress, you're going to break it. And then when you break it, then you get sued because, of course, you recommended movement that should be avoided across the board. If you look on websites, what's their recommendation for osteoporosis? Avoid flexion. But the question is, how do you tie your shoes? How do you wipe your feet when you're drying yourself from shower? How do you do that? Do you need to brace yourself? Do you need to put yourself into some kind of artificial straight posture and completely avoid movements? Some of you who've worked with me for long enough know my story that one day I was working long ago, maybe 20 plus years ago. I was working with somebody who came to consult, and I watched her how she takes her shoes off, and I see it's very strange movements, stiff, awkward, holding her breath, getting red on her face, very stiff. I thought she was in pain, and I asked her, so are you in pain? And she said, oh no, Marek. And she said it with a little bit of pride. When I was 40 years old, and at that time she was probably 70, so 30 years later, she told me when I was 40, I had an acute disc pain. And the doctor told me never ever to bend forward. And for the rest of her life, she eliminated flexion from movement. This is a risky thing because I'm not sure she made herself a big service by that. And when slowly we started to reintroduce movements with her, when she could gain confidence that it's not something dangerous, big load was lifted. So we need stress, but with all tissues, whether it's bone, whether it's osteoporotic bone, or whether it's a tendon that is about to get ripped, or muscle that is tearing, or ligament that is tearing, there's always a question: what is the right amount of load? Where is the homeostasis? Because you want to be in homeostasis, and from time to time visit overload zone, and then back to homeostasis to recuperate and visit overload. So this way we're growing stronger, more resilient spine, more resilient tissues, more resilient bones. How are we going to improve our spine flexion? Throughout this course, we will be working on redistribution of movement throughout your whole spine, and not only your spine. We'll learn how to use our eyes, our hips, our feet, our toes, our whole 206 bones, how to move them so the bending will be uniform. We will work on our habits, because a lot of times the way some tissues are loaded more than others is because of the habitual activity. And we'll introduce a concept of lengthening while bending versus compression. How does it sound? Ready? Ready to start? All right. So come to sitting. Let's start with this idea of bending with compression versus bending without compression. Sit on the front edge of the seat, please. So as you're sitting, see if you can differentiate between bending forward while compressing, meaning your head is shrinking into the body, kind of like as if somebody push you. Don't do it, don't do big movement because you can injure yourself actually by doing this. Compressing and bending forward, reaching as if you wanted to tie your shoes. Do this in order to recognize your distance between your pelvis and head getting shorter and you starting to bend. This is a risky business. This is a risky business for osteoporosis, is a risky business for muscles and tendons of your muscles, ligaments of the back, and also for the discs, because you're implying compression while bending. That I can't tell you how many foils in my fencing I broke by trying to bend the blade while compressing versus by elongating. Now, the second choice, can you think of leaning forward and doing it such as if you were hanging through your hair downward, as if you were hanging like a bat while you're bending forward, as if you wanted to touch your toes. Think of tying shoes. How do you tie your shoes? Or how do you dry your toes after bath? Could you allow your hips to bend forward, pelvis to tilt forward, and your spine actually, instead of scrunching to get taller? Could you imagine if I held your head and I pulled it a little bit away from your sacrum, away from your tailbone, as you bend to reach to your sack, or your maybe foot is too far, maybe just go to your shin, slide your hand to on your one shin, and make the movement with an idea of lengthening. And then compare that with the similar movement, sliding your hand on your calf or shin, but actually scrunching, getting a little shorter. Can you feel the difference? You feel the difference that one way compresses you and one way actually could be healthier. Perfect. Come back up to standing. Stand. And as you're standing, think of, what do you feel your spine's like? You saw the ideal spine with these three curves, 30, 35 degrees of neck lordosis, meaning arch, about 40 degrees of roundness in the middle back, and then another 40, 45 degrees of arch in the lower back. But this is ideal. Nobody has an ideal spine like this. I never seen an ideal spine in my life. I don't have ideal spine. We all have our own variations. As you're standing, what's your overall sense? If you were to draw, if I gave you a Sharpie marker and I ask you, what's your sense of the curve of the neck, the curve of the middle back, the curve of the lower back, position of your pelvis? Good. And then a few times, look down on the floor as if you wanted to see the carpet in front of you or wall in front of you. Or if you were trying shoes, new shoes on, and you want to see what do they look like, and there's no mirror, so you need to look at your shoes and feel how the movement is for you. And then come back. Do this 2-3 times so you'll have a chance to feel what it feels like after the session. Good. Perfect. And now please come lie on the floor. We'll start a new lesson.